ITIL. It's this public agreed upon framework that we have for following good IT service management practices. So that's one way that I think that we try to handle pushback. And then again, starting small, show where the benefits can come. Nancy, you talked about some of the things that you can do early on to foster adoption, and I think it's interesting one of the projects you're working on now that they really elected to focus on strategy and policy up front. And the way we can sometimes facilitate that is to provide help through an assessment of the organization and helping organizations to see where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, and where their areas of focus should be.
Exactly. And to better understand what the concerns are and to capture those concerns and bring them to light and provide solutions and options to those. I think oftentimes, the comment that ITIL is too complicated or, the process is too complicated. Well, there's also, concern about structure. And for, some in the IT environment that have, if you're in an environment where there's a lack of structure, and then you bring a structure like an ITIL framework into place, then it's logical that there would maybe some pushback, and helping to better understand and to provide training on the different processes.
That's an excellent segue. Thank you for that, because there was a question about training too. So the question was, how do you structure training around, if you're having a new system implementation for a large IT organization, how do you introduce training for ITIL? I think, again, Dick had a good example of how it was done with UNH, where we provided a lot of ITIL knowledge, not necessarily the full ITIL foundation course, but we provided ITIL what's called the Polestar simulation exercise. It can be done either a half day or a full day, and just getting everybody in there talking about some of these things. And really, all you're looking to do there is to get everybody familiar with the terminology. So again, communication and terminology are big components of that. So when you're trying to get this to a large IT organization, like this one, the question was about an organization with 750 people. As much information and communication that you can get out there about kind of the why. ITIL is the why we're doing this. So sometimes you're implementing new tools, but ITIL hopefully is going to be the driving force and the driving processes behind all of that.
Yes, and to communicate early and communicate often throughout this life cycle of the project.
Absolutely.
So that when it comes to training, then the resources that are being trained are familiar on the terminology, it's familiar on the the technology, familiar with examples of how ITIL processes may work in your environment. Some real life examples so that they get an idea of how it's going to be, rather than not just all academic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Nikki, we have a very large customer located in the Washington, D.C. area with a huge IT footprint, and they've really realized the value of ITIL training. And I know that over time, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think we've been working with them for the past year, and they've had class after class after class so that they can get everybody eventually up to speed here.
Yep, we have 5 more classes planned for the fall already. So
yeah. And, this is sort of a conversation we had just a minute ago, but one of my favorite management gurus is a guy named Dan Heath, and one of his favorite things to say is resistance to change is often a lack of clarity. So that just goes to show you how important it is to understand and provide the upfront training, and the resistance to change goes away. People understand what they're getting themselves into, and they're less reluctant to push back.
Yeah, and I've had some managers say to me that there was a certain amount of griping and resistance to even attending ITIL classes, but despite all of that, they found that everybody was actually taught using the terminology, using the words, so they had learned something, I guess, despite themselves, and it really did help with communication with the new organization.
And there's one more thing I wanted to mention about that, because I do see the question is structure user training around a new ITIL-based ITSM system. And so the training that I conduct, because I also conduct training for the Remedy ITSM suite. And so the training classes that we do are hands-on, interactive sessions that begin with an ITIL discussion, because we're talking about the different roles, we're talking about the different, the terminology and the tool set, kind of a refresher reminder of, if they've taken the ITIL foundations, they're familiar with the incident manager, change coordinators, problem coordinators. However, starting out the training with those and then referring back during the training sessions to ITIL process and ITIL terminology helps to bring it all together. And also what we do is we use, our training sessions are focused on the client's data, the client's environments, and so it just brings it all together with real-life examples and how the processes will be used in the new tool set. And like I say, just from a, overall, and these are the benefits of using the system and the benefits that they'll be able to glean from it as they move into operations with it as they go live. So that's another thing that we do to help, with adoption.
Okay. Moving right along, here's another question that just came in, and the question is, do you know of any sites that might have service catalog examples? We have had issues getting management and senior management to create the proper services rather than mostly our services are the individual IT teams. Nikki or Nancy, you can think of that, but there's a couple that came to mind when I saw that question. We have done some work at a DHS site, and one of the most important things that we've done there is help set up a service catalog. And so that means that the users now, if they want to request maybe a new hardware, maybe it's a PC or a laptop, they can get that provisioned, and it's kind of a one-step operation as opposed to having to request this, waiting a long amount of time. I think they can request cell phones, they request software. It's all part of the service catalog that was set up, and it's had amazing impact on reducing the number of calls to the service desk. Another example of sort of a service catalog, or in this particular case, it may be more of a service request management system, and that's at the House of Reps, where we've been working for quite some time. They've taken a number of different requests. Like, for example, if people may not know this, but there's actually underneath the House of Reps building, there's a workshop, and they build furniture, and they have drapes, and there's carpet and so on that they'll build out for each individual office. And you can request this through a service catalog system. Why not? So that's another very good example of something that works well, and certainly makes the whole order process much more efficient.
Yeah, and that's an example of a good actionable service catalog, and that's really the goal ultimately when you're developing a service catalog, is to make it actionable by the end users. You mentioned DFAS, I think, and for the Department of Defense customers, there are some actual guidelines that I believe I have seen out on the web, and Nancy, you may know more about this. But there are some examples of their service catalogs out there. We kind of collect them along the way. When I find them, I usually try to keep them. I was actually trying to do a quick search on my own hard drive, but of course I don't have that to hand at the moment. But I think that even if you just look at some of the ITIL books and at the service design book in particular, it does give you a little bit of an outline. Of course, ITIL isn't very prescriptive. I mean, I think one of the questionnaires made the comment that it's just recommendations. It's not really a prescribed way to do things necessarily. But if you do a search, there are examples out there. But for most organizations, it's going to be something very specific to the organization. But for some of the things, there of course are very common types of services. So you have a lot of times it's called desktop computing, so that any support or personal computing, any support for desktops and laptops, and networking, email or messaging service, file sharing and printing services. I mean, those are the types of categories that we normally see in a service catalog. They are intended to be fairly broad, and they are not then typically vendor specific. Nancy, any examples?
I see they're asking for like sites. In the past, I believe it's North Carolina State may have a service catalog you might want to take a look at. I'm pulling the total blank on any other sites at the moment. However, we can certainly take that as an action item and provide a list. I believe we have a list of some different sites that have really good mature service catalogs in them, or at least service catalog examples. Right now I'm working with a client in building their business services and the underlying IT services that support those services. And it is quite the undertaking to start from scratch and define a business service and, the hours of operation and the SLAs and service targets and, defining external providers. And so, but it is absolutely critical for the success of these services, and it is what drives their business. So it's it's very critical, and it is a very large undertaking, and it can certainly be started, one service at a time. So it's.
Here's an interesting question. I don't know if you saw this on the chat, and it's interesting because I think I hear the question a lot, and because there is some confusion between incident management and request fulfillment. And the question comes up from customers a lot of times because they're trying to run reports on their incident request or their incident records, and they have to somehow figure out how to separate out the incidents that take a long time to close. And the reason why these incidents take a long time to close typically is because they're not simple break-fix issues. They are requests for a new or an improved service. So, for example, somebody's requesting or has a request for a new laptop. Well, that may take a week or so, depending on the level of urgency, for the laptop to be delivered and to be set up and configured and so on. So the question was, in ITIL, would you use an incident ticket for request management even if you have the ability to add tailored workflow to each incident type? And what I have heard and what I teach normally is that, yes, you would use a single source for incoming requests from your end users. The way that we manage it typically is that we categorize each request either as a support request or incident, those two are synonymous, or it's a service request. And first of all, by making that differentiation, that helps with your reporting, so you can look at the true mean time to repair incidents as opposed to mean time to provide new service, which are two typically very different things. So it helps with reporting. It helps with how do you route the particular request. You can have different types of escalations on each so that the time frames or your service levels, so going back to service level management, service level targets will be different for incidents versus service requests. But yes, I think it makes it easier for everybody if those can all have a single channel into the organization, and it's often called the incident module, but in truth, it is really the request module that handles both incidents and support requests, incidents and service requests. Pretty straightforward, I think.
Yep. Switching gears, I don't know if there's any other questions that we haven't answered, but I've got one in the meantime, and we've certainly talked about the value of ITIL training. How would you all recommend getting certified? Either classroom, online, self-study. Is there any best way, and sort of what's your experience with that?
I think, Nancy, you mentioned yesterday, and you and I are, I think, alike on this, that we prefer classroom training. I think for my learning style, it's more effective.